Good morning and thank you for joining us. We will be beginning shortly. Thank you for joining us for this morning's webinar. We will be beginning shortly. Good morning and thank you for joining us. We will be starting shortly. We're just waiting for a few more participants to join. I make that 1 minute past 11, so I think we will get started. So good morning and hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this one of our CLA autumn series of webinars. On behalf of the CLA, I am delighted to welcome to you what I am sure will be an informative event. My name is Land Managem and I am the Regional Director for the Southwest region, and I will be your chair for today's proceedings. My thanks go to our partners Carter Jonas and Clydesdale Bank, who both have speaking roles today. Before moving to the subject of today's event, a brief update from us here at the CLA. Throughout this year, the CLA has supported the membership in offering advice and representation to government through what has been an unprecedented year. A national lockdown, through to a short recovery period, and perhaps for some, an uncertain next few months. The COVID webpage is highly comprehensive, covering the breadth of government support and information that our members need for all aspects of their businesses. There are a number of member-only briefings covering a wide range of topics. We keep them updated as government advice changes in how we can support and nurture those hardest hit, but also offering practical advice for employers, the self-employed, and rural businesses alike. A particular area of concern has been the self-catering and hospitality sector, hardest hit by recent changes. And you may have read in the press that the VAT rate for this sector has been cut from 20% to 5%, which has now been extended until the 31st of March next year. an important measure to help those who have been impacted, which the CLA lobbied with other bodies to achieve. We would also encourage members to contact their regional office should they need additional advice and support. And of course, all of our previous webinars have been recorded and are available to watch again. In terms of lobbying, the party conference season is in full swing, and the CLA have been engaged on a number of fringe events focusing on the importance of the CLA's Rural Powerhouse campaign, with 5 main themes which will highlight how the rural economy can become more dynamic and productive, and how landowners can play an even greater role in answering the key challenges facing the country. The agricultural bill has been under close scrutiny in the House of Lords with the 3rd reading last week, and we will be looking to see this back in the House of Commons very soon. The Environment Bill will be coming on afterwards, and also, of course, the Trade Bill. Moving on to today's event, we are under no illusion that 2021 is set to be an extraordinary turbulent year. The UK will leave the jurisdiction of the European Union, with the future trading arrangements yet to be confirmed and the transition away from direct payments to begin in earnest. Today's event will offer an insight into the changes to agricultural policy in the early transition period to help farmers and landowners make plans for the future. We are fortunate to be joined today by a panel of experts who will guide us through their thoughts on the changes to agricultural policy and the next steps. I should remind you that today's session is being recorded for future use, including availability to other members, and will be available on our website after the event. The format for this event is that our speakers will each talk about their area first. This will be followed by your questions, which I will pose to the panel on your behalf. Please do feel free to answer questions at any time using the Q&A button on your screen. Please do restrict your questions to the session subject matter, otherwise approach the CLA for advice in the normal way. There will also be the occasional poll, which I do hope you will respond to as well. Our programme today is full and topical, and therefore I will now move on to handing over to our first speaker, Susan Twining.
Morning, everybody. I'm going to give a run through of the current policy developments in agriculture, but in advance of that, we put a poll up on the screen, and I'd appreciate it if you could answer that question, which is really about whether you've made any plans to replace the income that you'll be losing from phasing out of BPS. So while you're doing that, I'll just make a start. I'm going to cover 3 main areas. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to policy developments in England and Wales. Once I get my slides to move. There we go. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction across England and Wales, but then I'm going to focus the details of the new programmes coming through into England, because there's more information on those, and look at some of the timelines, because it's actually the timelines that are as important as the policies. So looking across at plans for England and Wales, firstly, I think the key points on this, I won't go into detail. England are making a start to cutting direct payments from 2021. That's 3 months away. And there will be new schemes being introduced from 2021 onwards. In Wales, while they're part of the Agriculture Bill going through the House of Lords and House of Commons now, through a special schedule, they're planning to introduce their own agriculture bill in Wales next year. And it will be at that point that they will start to make more detailed plans about what their policies and programmes are going to be. In the meantime, they're going to continue with the current direct payments and agri-environment schemes. So looking a little bit further forward to plans for England, I don't know if any of you were up at 5:45 this morning, but George Eustace did steal a little bit of my thunder, I have to say. But for those of you who didn't get up this morning and didn't hear it, he was giving a bit of an outline of the policies, which I'm going to be running through now. So most of what I'm talking about is based on the Farming for the Future policy statement that was published in February. But there is a new statement that's going to be published in November, which we're expecting and campaigning to have a lot more detail in it, to actually fill in the gaps about what's going to happen and what it will mean for your business. This will form part of the first of a 7-year multi-annual financial agreements. Now, these are in a similar way to the Common Agriculture Policy. There is a 7-year programme of expenditure with a vision and programmes laid out. And that, under the Agriculture Bill, that first multi-annual financial agreement needs to be, multi-annual financial assistance plan needs to be set out by the end of this year. So it's part of that programme. So firstly, I'm going to look at it in groups of policies that are coming through. There are actually 19 different things that I counted up, or priority things that are coming up, but I've blocked them into different groups. The first one is on direct payment transition. So it should be familiar to you by now that direct payments are going to be cut starting in 2021. We know that in 2021, the cuts will be a progressive rate. So those in receipt of less than £30,000 will have a cut of 5%, but that gradually increases for those that are in receipt of higher payments, where businesses at the higher level will be having cuts of in excess of 20% in total. We don't have any information on what the cuts are going to be in remaining years, but what we've suggested is that until we have more information, then we should assume a flat rate of the remaining amount for budgeting purposes. So that could, if you take a flat rate, that would be a cut of between 10 and 15% a year, depending on what your first year cuts were. Important point is that there's no cuts and no more direct payments after 2028. So that's probably the biggest thing that's going to start hitting businesses next year and progressively over the period. By 2024, when we expect ELM to be fully available to everybody, under those assumptions, many businesses will have lost between 30 and 50% of their direct payments, which is quite a sobering thought. But alongside that, there are also plans to de-link the direct payments. That will mean that when it's introduced for everybody, there will no longer be a need to either send in an annual application form or even continue to farm, and you will no longer be expected to comply with cross-compliance, although you will still need to meet the statutory requirements. This is mainly to make administration more simple for both government and yourselves, and it will mean that you'll just receive the remaining annual payments as set out. The other option that they're looking at is a lump sum exit scheme, and this will be an option that will be available for eligible recipients to take the remaining payments upfront on condition of leaving farming. This may be available for only 1 year, or it may be over a couple of years. All that is still to be decided, and along with a de-link payment, the details will be discussed in a consultation later this autumn. So given that the Environmental Land Management Scheme isn't coming in until 2024, the current agri-environment schemes are going to continue. Now, this isn't simple. There are a number of different countryside stewardship stages. The countryside stewardship existing agreements, so those of you already in countryside stewardship, will continue to be under EU rules for the time being, and they will continue to the end of their agreement period. There's also a plan to continue the HLS extensions. Anybody who is entering into countryside stewardship from 2021 will be under the new UK agreements and under slightly different rules. And you can continue to enter into countryside stewardship right up until 2024. And those agreements can either roll on, or you can switch into ELMs at the appropriate time. The plan is that there will continue to be simplification and making them more attractive and more and easier for everyone to get engaged with them. And they will, of course, include woodland grant schemes as well. If we take a closer look at the Environmental Land Management Scheme, we're in a phase of development still, and from now until 2024, there's continuing development of the policies. I think the key point here is that the ELM will only be fully available to everyone from 2024. And one of the problems that the CLA have had and have been lobbying government for is that gap between direct payments being cut for the next 3 years before we can fully access ELM. And we've been arguing for shallow cuts in direct payments. And we have been listened to, but the solution is perhaps not quite the same. the government DEFRA is now looking at a sustainable farming incentive scheme, which will be brought in early in 2022. And that will bring forward some elements of ELM Tier 1 into an earlier programme. If we look in a bit more detail at that early period, so the development period between 2021 and 2024, there's a lot going on, and there has been a lot going on. There's been a number of ELM tests and trials, and many of you will have been involved in some of those. It's been a wide-reaching programme. The CLA has run 2 test and trial programmes, and we've been asked to extend one of ours. I put in a proposal to extend one of ours. The ELMS pilots will be starting in 2021, looking at Tier 1. The pilots are there to test and refine the design, the administration, the advice and payments, and make sure that it is ready to operate fully in 2024. And then alongside this, there's the possible new scheme, the Sustainable Farming Incentive. The plan is that that will be available to everybody, and it will act as an entry point into ELM in the future. So ELM from 2024, its design is a 3-tier design. Tier 1 is about sustainable farming and forestry practices. Tier 2 is more challenging, locally targeted environmental outcomes with more ambition, more environmental ambition. And then Tier 3 is a landscape scale land use change, which is primarily focusing on peatland restoration and forestry and woodland. I think what's quite reassuring, hopefully, is that a lot of the design of ELM that's coming through now reflects a lot of the principles that we set out in the land management contract back in May 2018, before government had even got an outline of what ELM was going to look like. So looking more at the farming side, there's a number of farm productivity and resilience programmes. You might have heard this morning that the very last round of the CAP RDPE funding for the countryside productivity grant has been announced. So that call is open until the 4th of November. That's the small productivity grant scheme for grants of from 3,000 up to 12,000. That's open today. But that is the last part of the rural development programme under CAP. From 2021, there'll be new productivity grant programmes for small grant scheme and large grant schemes, operating in a similar way to the one they have done already, but with a few changes. DEFRA is also investing in an innovation and research programme. And this is something that you should keep alert to, because I think this will be part of, it's a great way to engage in research that is right for you, that will actually drive productivity. At the moment, there are 3 themes, or three different pots. The first is an accelerator fund, which is really aimed at businesses and farmer-led trials on prototypes. So it's short-term projects, just sort of looking to see if something will work and to stimulate that change. The second one is themed collaboration, which is for larger projects up to 4 years and higher value across 7 priority areas. And then there's industry-led syndicates, which will provide funding, match funding for groups that get together and fund their own research. So there's some real opportunities to get involved in research there. And then finally, on productivity, there's a Farm Resilience Fund, which the pilot in 2021, which may continue, and they're looking at a new entrant support scheme to help county farms and landowners develop new opportunities for new entrants. The animal and plant health schemes are in some ways a continuation of many of the schemes that are already underway. The animal welfare grant scheme is new and will be available from 2021, and that's for providing enrichment for animal welfare. And then there's new pathways coming through as a pilot from 2022 onwards. And same with tree health, there's a pilot running for felling and restocking diseased trees that will eventually become a tree health scheme through ELM. And a broader, that's the agriculture policy core components, but on the rural economy, the government is introducing a UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which will replace some of the CAP rural development funding, such as leader and growth programmes, and that will be available from 2022. So just, I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, you'll be pleased to know, but this is just to say agriculture policy is just one aspect of what we're looking at. There's other drivers of change, the Environment Act that will be coming through next year, Climate Change Act that set out the net zero emission targets, a whole load of strategies and publications that will influence policy coming forward in the next few months. Wales is no different. They've got their agriculture bill coming up next year, and they're underpinned by a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that kind of sets you've got to think about the future in the current policy development. And then we've got COVID-19 and the impact on the economy and budgets. And clearly the agriculture budget is only certain until 2024, when we have the next general election. So we've got all to play for after that. And obviously, as Anne mentioned earlier, we've got the end of the Brexit transition later this year and no view of a trade agreement or not. So in summary, agriculture policy has devolved. So we're going to have different policies across England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. The direct payments is going to have the most immediate and biggest impact on farm businesses. Only 25% of farming enterprises are profitable without direct payments, so we cannot hide from this. And it's starting in England next year. So I think looking at actions, I think it's ensuring that the core business is sound without direct payments. So what impact will removing direct payments have? And I think be ready to look at opportunities. There's going to be new policies and market opportunities that will be available. So it's not all doom and gloom. But the key thing is to be ready for change, as very few businesses are going to be untouched by these changes. The CLA is here to help through a number of routes, magazine, telephone advice at national and regional, and we've got a number of guidance notes, as Anne mentioned, but we're also continuing our policy development and lobbying to help shape future policy. So we are here to help. So hopefully that's a useful run through. The results of the poll were that 57% have not made any plans for replacing the lost income of BPS, while 43% have. And the good news for that is that is higher people who are prepared than when we ran that poll in early lockdown. So there is progress. I'm now going to hand over to Brian Richardson, Head of Agriculture at Clydesdale Bank, who's going to give his insights into how businesses should react to these changes. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Susan. A really thorough go through of what's happening at the moment, and also I think highlighting a lot of the questions that are still outstanding. What I'd like to do, I'm just struggling to run through my slides at the moment. Could you move them on for me then, please? So just looking at what's driving policy at the moment, we've talked a lot about Brexit. It's been the theme since June 2016, over 4 years ago. Moving to a UK-based policy after almost 50 years of European CAP policy. One that we hope keeps food production as a priority, but a lot of question marks over that. Shorter policy cycles. Susan talked about 7-year policy being developed, but also mentioned the next election in 2024. So in terms of the funding for those, we're moving into much shorter periods. And I think that will be a very major change for us in terms of how we look at policy as we go forward. The other thing here, we're talking about England and Wales and potentially devolved policy in Wales. I'm here just outside Carlisle, 7 miles away from the Scottish border, and the Scottish government certainly has an ambition to have quite a different policy. So again, one of the drivers going forward could well be a significant different in the economics of farming north and south of the border and in the other devolved areas. The other big driver at the moment is climate change and the net zero agenda. Farming, I think, certainly when this debate started, seen very much as part of the problem. Putting it in context, we know it accounts for 10% of CO2 emissions, a lot less than wider industry and transport, for instance. And I think it's how we can focus that agenda to moving farming back into the part of the solution. And the lack of focus, as we know, around that debate with the net zero agenda around food security. So just moving on to the next slide. Michael Gove described these changes that are coming down the line very much as a revolution in how we produce food, and he also commented on the broader context of wider forces driving change in farming, food policy, and our relationship with the rest of the natural world. So the next slide just perhaps highlights the email that came out from government at the same time or just after he made those comments, which perhaps alluded to some of those other thought processes that were going on. Officials within government suggesting Britain doesn't need farmers, and even to the extent of suggesting it would be much simpler and probably cheaper to import all our own food. So that set the debate, I think, if we move on to the next slide. And then, of course, came COVID, which huge challenge for society and a lot of tragedy around that. But for agriculture, really, in February and early March, we saw this 20% of food service business closed down. So demand stopping overnight for that and moving very much into retail and supermarket. We saw empty shelves, and that was the first time for most people to see empty shelves and experience that. I think before COVID, it was certainly nothing anyone ever assumed would happen. We saw produce and milk having to be disposed of. Great concerns over how we were going to get that food collected up in terms of having people available and able to travel to the UK. But agriculture, I think, and the food industry generally demonstrated its resilience and the sector's ability to change to those new circumstances. And effectively, I think there was a hiatus for 4 to 8 weeks, and then the supply chain quickly rebalanced. I think what it's done, and perhaps surprised some in government, is show that adaptability and resilience of the industry and ability to change relatively quickly, and also highlighting the importance of food security. So in amongst all this, perhaps COVID has helped just reset the debate a little bit. So just moving on to the next slide, we would hopefully now have a renewed debate on food security and where that fits in all these changes that are coming down the road. We've got the new commission now looking at food standards and trade deals. I certainly don't think we're going to get anything like we would like to see in those trade deals going forward. It's always a matter of a trade-off. And I think if we had a poll on what people thought about food security, etc., we perhaps, and food standards, we perhaps come up with different results. So it's going to be a challenge, but at least it's on the agenda now. The environmental agenda and net zero 2040, I think, is going to come very much back into the focus in 2021. It's been, because COVID has been in the headlines, it's been pushed to the side a little bit, but it's very much going to come back with a renewed focus on that side, and something we need to be aware of. Productivity was mentioned earlier, and I think it's something I've been banging on around for a long time now. The HDB have done a lot of good work, I think, highlighting some of the productivity gap we may have in this country. We may not be quite as productive as some of our near neighbours and some other states. Lots of different challenges around for us, but I think it is a challenge to talk about the fact we may not be as productive as we think, but I think we should look at that, and we can look at productivity in the light of good environmental stewardship and in a very sustainable way as well. And linking into that, I think, is the use of ag tech. This is not just about new equipment and drones, etc., but there is some fantastic new equipment coming along, and it really does work. But also big data and how we use that data in precision farming and agricultural systems. I think the pig and poultry industry, I think over the last 10 and 15 years have shown how they've used technology and big data really to drive productivity in their industry, to really improve results, improve productivity. Remember, those two sectors are unsupported, so they've had a very great focus, but they've now got, I think, really a world-class business in terms of what they deliver, and I think it's a good point to the rest of the industry. And they're now using that technology, I think, to help drive the agenda in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, and some exciting work going on that side. There will be divergence in the approach. I think some farmers will very much focus on food production. I can think areas of the country where elms will take very much a second place, if at all, but they'll focus on food production, still really focused on environmental measures, etc., but really focused on food production. Another area focused very much on environmental and public good, and of course a good chunk in the middle. But what it does mean, of course, is that there's 2.7 billion or thereabouts of support payments that we see. I've said over 50%. It varies depending on when you look at it, but figures the other day were certainly looking at that 60–70% of profitability of farming is accounted for in those payments coming through. So a huge change. It's not going to fall the same way and in the same pots as it did before. So it's important to realise for farmers there's going to be significant change there. So just moving on, I think what the message is really is about preparing your business for a new future, securing your future after direct payments end. Yes, there's a lot of policy uncertainty, and I think as Susan went through, there's a lot of questions to be answered, but that doesn't stop you really planning around the future, what it means for your business, and where will those public goods payments feature in your business? How important are they going to be to you? And do you know how you're performing now? I think as an industry generally, we've stopped doing benchmarking and looking at trying to measure how well our businesses are doing. So it's important, I think, we get back into that thinking and look at how productive our farm units are and where that balance between public goods and productivity should happen. Do you know what's involved in reducing your carbon footprint? There's some fantastic and relatively straightforward tools now for measuring a farm business unit's CO2 emissions. Certainly have a look at those. Some of them are actually free. I think the good thing about them is not just coming up with a number of your CO2 emissions, it's providing some indications of where there are some really quick wins and some improvements on productivity. Will all farmers want to continue? I think we do have the potential for a generation change in the industry, and some of our more senior members perhaps seeing this as an opportune time to pass over to the younger generation. And I think we've mentioned the outgoer scheme as well, or Susan mentioned that there will be less farmers potentially in the future taking this forward, because there is a lot of change to come. And it's not just about farming units and landowners, it's about the whole rural network of businesses that support agriculture. There is going to be huge change, and feed companies and chemical suppliers. There's going to be less money about in the industry. We're going to have to do things smarter and use less inputs, and that's going to change the whole industry. And I think it's time to look very closely at that. And just finally, Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank, lending to farmers accounts for about 20% of our business lending, so it's an incredibly important part of our business. It's about £1.5 billion we lend into the sector. There is going to be a lot of change. We're going to be working closely with our farm teams across the country, with our farmer customers, to support them in making these changes, in understanding where the changes, in understanding the environmental requirements coming. But I do see a very positive future for farming, but it's going to be very different, and there's going to be a lot of change coming. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to hand over now to Andrew Follows of Carter Jonas. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Brian. I have been asked to talk a little bit about how businesses are preparing on the ground, and I'll try to cover that in the slides going forwards. There is a saying that if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. I think that no longer applies. If you do what you've always done, you will not get what you've always got. We've heard that already. Support is disappearing or is changing, and so probably the mantra should be change is the new normal. I would like to move to the next slide. I think we're also having some similar problems. Thank you. So yeah, so in terms of understanding where a business is, I think it's critical that businesses look to plan, and by doing that, you start with understanding your assets and what's available. We've got a number of landowners joining the call today, so it's important that one looks at the whole asset that's available, both land, property, buildings, soil type, soil quality, water sources, and build that into the mix of the review. Location is key, and that will derive as to what people can do. To some people, an asset is also a liability. So being an urban fringe property may have problems with hair coursing and fly tipping, but also it could be the source to accessing income from the chimney pots. People I'd put as an asset with your business. I think the key asset to any business is its individuals, and that can be the principles of the business, or it could be the successors to come through. Our young people are our future, and understanding what their training is or training requirements, it's very, very important that we continually develop our workforces. Interests. I think a business that has strong interest will also drive and be successful. And technology, we've mentioned this before, we will continue to see changes in technology. It's very important that one understands what ability one has with current technology. Natural capital we've talked upon, that we touched on the Environment Bill coming forward, and the whole piece on natural capital and biodiversity net gain. And I think probably what was mentioned by Susan earlier in terms of the first part of the tier 1 support could provide an element for benchmarking for natural capital in terms of soil and water management. So it's really important that one understands what's got available. Next slide, please. So in terms of reviewing your business, having understood what you've got, consider the direction, ambition that a business has. I think that it's really key that a business looks at over a 5 or a 10-year period, especially given the schemes that one's going to be entering into. And as part of that, one needs to have some measurement, both environmental and financial. I think many schemes will require a commitment, and one needs to know what return they're prepared to take from them. And also from an environmental point of view, where the baseline is being improved, and what are the key hurdles along the way to any scheme that one has signed up to. I put structures and cooperation because I also feel that an area that businesses are going to have to be working towards is greater collaboration and cooperation. And that could be as much as on a very basic level, shared experience, right through to full joint ventures being contract farming or share farming operations. Keeping costs down, as Brian has alluded to, will be key to profitability and every focus that can be seen. We've got some landed estate businesses represented. I think the other point that I would bear is the tenanted sector and understanding tenants and what they are seeking to do with their businesses. The average age of farmers could be 58, it could be 60, it could be 62, depending which survey you want to read. What is clear is those businesses need open discussion about where they fit in the future. We're probably likely to see many tenant rent review notices being served. It's probably more important to talk to people to understand what their businesses are and where they fit in the future, as opposed to arguing over £10 an acre in rent. I do remember speaking to a young farmer, and he saw that there were two brakes on the industry. One was direct support, and the second was the Agricultural Holdings Act. Well, we're moving away and releasing direct support, but the Agricultural Holding Act and succession tenancies will remain. So that's one way that we'll see a move forward. In terms of funding, I would suggest that all businesses look very closely at their funding, and we're seeing at the moment the base rate is as low as it has been, and it's very important that businesses consider their funding structures going forward. And I'm sure that Brian or his team would be more than happy to talk to you about that. Next slide, please. Having carried out a full review, it's important that one considers how else one can access unsupported income. COVID-19 has been referred to, and what we've seen is more new users, I would suggest, into the countryside and to rural locations. Now, that did cause problems at the beginning as lockdown was in place. We had access issues, but it is a new customer base, if one likes, that needs to be engaged with. And that has followed through with staycations and rural tourism, and indeed rural offices. We're seeing definitely an uplift in our requirements through our leisure side for rural tourism, and also with rural offices. We can see that the commute is most likely to have, it won't be dead, but it will be much reduced. With that, I can see possibly a WeWork in the countryside model where rural business centres are going to spring up. And that will again be down to communications and the ability to service those. I put renewable energy because one needs to look at that as an unsupported sector now, and it's very clear that operators are still looking for solar sites. Prime Minister has said a commitment to greater energy from renewable sources, albeit offshore, but it's an area that we're definitely seeing more interest in. And if one is pushing one's offices or tourism, electric vehicle charging points is an area where our renewable team is particularly busy at the moment. They've introduced a new phrase of range anxiety that one will need to be aware of when we're driving our electric cars in the future. So you'll need a quick charge or a slow charge, but be aware of these opportunities for further income and unsupported income, which is the key message. Natural capital we've talked about, and biodiversity net gain is will be a commercial deal with a commercial operator. And again, understanding what one's baseline is key to understanding what opportunities and options are available to a business. Net zero, everybody is pushing towards net zero. We as a country, as various organisations, and further down the supply chain, people will be being encouraged to go to net zero. So as Brian said, ensuring one understands through a carbon calculation where one is with its business is key. Broadband and climate change are other issues which could be seen as opportunities or constraints. Climate change is here to stay, and we've been talking earlier about the Tier 3 scheme of the elms, which is going to be much more broader in terms of peatland restoration and tree planting. So opportunities there to access support. Next slide, please. Finally, I would concur with the other speakers that change is inevitable. Businesses must embrace change. I would say that collaboration will be a great opportunity, and that's through joint ventures or other opportunities. If I was an investment manager, I'd be considering and discussing balanced portfolios. Really, that is just making sure you don't have all your eggs in one basket, and look at unsupported income streams for a business. Technological advances are going to help, and it is something that one must keep abreast of. And following with that, we're in an ever moving and fast changing place, and so keeping updated for any business will be key. And this is why events like this and having a body like the CLA is so important to provide that information to the industry. With that, I believe we are now handing over to the question and answer session.
Great, thank you all very much. Very interesting discussions, and we've had a number of questions come in. So just to get the ball rolling, I'd just like to ask you a question regarding the ELM scheme, and I'm going to put this to Susan first. The ELM scheme is publicly funded, and there is an emerging private sector market for environmental delivery, e.g. carbon markets and net gain. What can you say about these?
Oh, thanks, Anne. I mean, I think the private sector funding could be equally important, if not more important, to many businesses in the future for environmental delivery of all different sorts. I mentioned earlier about the guidance notes that we do. We published our first natural capital guidance note. Natural capital is a term that some people get a little bit anxious about because, you know, what does it mean? What is it about? We explain all that in the first guidance note. We're about to publish our second one, which is more about the environmental markets, what they are, how you can access them, who you need to talk to. And there are a number of really good operators coming onto the market with ideas, particularly around carbon and trees, because that's underpinned. And this is important, I think, from the regulatory point, that carbon markets are underpinned by the Woodland Carbon Code that set out a clear way of how to account for that carbon. So both parties, the buyer and the seller, knows what they're selling and how they're going to be measured. It's the same with biodiversity net gain. That's being mandated in the Environment Bill. And that will set up a private sector market from housing developers who need to replace any biodiversity lost in their developments elsewhere. So either within the site itself, but quite often that's going to be somewhere else. So there's an opportunity for land managers and landowners to be part of that marketplace. That one's, there's already a voluntary market there. So that one's already been tried and tested. And again, it's got a biodiversity matrix and how you calculate and what you need to do to change that, and already examples of some of the contracts. There's a lot of new players coming onto the market as well, and I think, you know, you need to ask yourself questions in the same way as back when all the renewable energy started coming onto the market. You know, what are we offering? What are you selling? And there's and part of our next guidance notes goes through a checklist of things that you need to look at in those markets. So there's some exciting opportunities, but I think caution and some foresight needs to be applied to looking at those new opportunities.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to a question regarding ELMS that has come in from Simon Dixon Smith. Is it clearly acknowledged within government that the payment rates for ELMS need to be at incentive levels, not just income foregone? I.e., will the MAFA funding, that's the multi-annual financial assistance funding, represent additional income to the industry rather than just an alternative income? Susan, if I could start with you again.
Yeah, this is something that we've been lobbying hard about, that the need to recognise there's lots of different ways that you could value nature. One is to look at the actual value of it. What does it deliver? What would people be, you know, what does it actually deliver? That's the natural capital accounting method. And it's really difficult to do, and you get some really high values. You also get some really low values, because some things we think are valuable aren't as valuable as we might think. The bottom end of it is the cost incurred and income forgone, which is where current agri-environment schemes are pinned. And that basically, you know, covers your cost with a little margin for your lost income from whatever you used to do on the land. And we've been making the case strongly that and it has been recognised that the payment rates need to be higher if you actually want people to engage in this. It needs to have a profit element, a proper profit element, and be recognised. So that is being looked at. We will start to see what the payment rates are going to be when the pilots start, because they will need to be issuing what those payments are at that point. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that this is going to be the golden goose. And I think the main thing that I would suggest that you do is look at your costs of delivering some of these options, so that you're at least starting from your own base where you think the value, you know, where you think you would be happy to engage in, and the offers that are being made. So it is incredibly frustrating that we don't have greater clarity on this, because that's the one bit missing from the puzzle for the future. But I think there are things that we can do to get ready, and looking at our cost of delivery is the first thing that I would look at.
Thank you. Yes. And just one more question before we move on to another area of discussion. Anne Wilcox has sent in a question, and it's regarding HLS, and it's with the continued rollover of HLS under the EU rules. Is there a big risk of large penalties being applied for the duration of the agreement, so 10 to 14 years of a clawback? Will the EU still be responsible for the monitoring and compliance of these schemes until they end?
Is that for me as well?
Sorry, yes, and then we'll move on to some other areas.
Yeah, there is under current rules, there could be a clawback that goes back to the beginning of the agreement, but it is something that is being looked at, and certainly something that we would like to, we're lobbying to get changed if it can be done, so that the schemes could be changed into UK rules, but that hasn't been agreed yet. So if you're under an EU countryside stewardship agreement or HLS, then the current rules still apply. And that's, in some ways, that's the balance you've got to make, so you've got an HLS agreement. Are you better to switch into the new UK countryside stewardship agreement rather than risk some of those backward looking penalties if there is a problem found, which I would hope there wouldn't be.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Now going to move on to some questions that have come in regarding landlord and tenant and rents. One from Edward Barham to ask the panelists, what effect do the panelists foresee on rents, which are currently supported underwritten by BFP? Up, down, or no change? Andrew, if we could start with you on that one.
Yep, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. I think there will be undoubtedly some downward pressure on rent, where there's been that direct underpinning from basic payment. However, market conditions and current tender rents that we're seeing on FBT rents show no reduction whatsoever. And I think that scarcity of land and the land-hungry nature of farming businesses will maintain many rents. So there'll be much discussion on the subject, but I think unless there is a great oversupply of land in a particular area, rents will stay at similar levels.
I think I agree very much with Andrew there. I think there is going to be a lot of economic pressure around the industry. So obviously rent is a cost people will look at and look to drive down. But I think the underlying demand there and part of the solution for many people in terms of producing food more efficiently and at lower cost is going to be scale. So I think that underlying demand will be there. There will be challenge, but I think the underlying demand will perhaps see rent levels perhaps not change not as much as we might assume they would.
Okay, thank you. And if we're saying rental levels might stay the same, but Tom Beverton's actually asked, is there likely to be an uplift in demand for rural offices perhaps as a consequence of COVID-19? Andrew, thoughts on that one?
Yes, I think it's something I touched on. We've certainly seen an uplift in demand. I think that has to be tempered with the pain that has also been felt by certain businesses in those rural offices. So dealing with, depending upon the type of business, poor rent payment or difficulties that tenants are having. So whilst there may be some increased demand, we're also having to manage and deal with some of the challenges that existing businesses have and existing tenants.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to ask a question if I can see. There it is. Another one from Edward Barham, and this is regarding TRIG, the Tenancy Reform Industry Group. Is there any current appetite to review landlord and tenant (FBT) terms to match the new world of UCAP to give both parties better flexibility? Susan, any thoughts on that one?
Well, I think TRIG is the place to discuss it. We've seen some amendments to tenancy coming through in the agriculture bill, but they've been relatively limited. There were lots of amendments through for further changes, but we felt that the best place to discuss these is through TRIG because that's the consensus building about what needs to do. There's no doubt that tenants, the tenancy arrangements need to be kept under review as we go through into the new agriculture policy world, because things will be changing rapidly. And the new reality about things like environmental management, tree planting are going to change some of that, and particularly collaboration, how you work together, and that sort of developing new and different relationships between two parties working together is something that we need to keep an open mind on. That's what the new entrance scheme is aiming to do, is to look at try and see if there's some innovative models that could be tried and tested about how you can work together, not necessarily traditional tenancies, but look at some other opportunities around joint working.
Thank you. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think we probably covered it really. I think the challenge really is at both ends. You've got Brian talking about scale and keeping costs down and businesses getting bigger, and then trying to find opportunities to get new entrants in as well, which is probably a whole new seminar on that, or webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on next to a question from Sebastian Anstruther. Diversification needs to be supported by planning and tax policies. What is the panel's view of current government thinking on these? Brian, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it keeps coming up into the headlines, looking at the tax regime and the favourable tax regime around land. It's obviously a concern to us in terms of the security angle, but I think certainly in recent discussions that have taken place, that's perhaps moved further off the agenda and into the background a little bit. But it is there, so it does come back in terms of whatever planning businesses are able to do about the future and secure their position. But certainly I think it was higher on my radar 18 months ago, 2 years ago, than I think it is now. But as I said at the beginning, we're going to move into a period of effectively parliamentary session or parliamentary periods, and at the end of those we could be faced with a different government with an entirely different agenda going forward.
Yeah. And actually, you're just staying on the planning subject. Andrew, we've had a question in from William Williams-Wynn. Given the planning restrictions in national parks, how do you suggest we diversify our businesses?
I think national parks are particularly difficult, as we know, in terms of getting planning. I think sometimes head up rather than head down is something to look at and consider, leveraging your asset and looking at a diversification that could be away from the home farm or home estate, with the value of your asset, cheap money. And we've seen that happening where industrial investment has been looked at, or office blocks, maybe pre-COVID rather than post-COVID. But certainly it's having that thought that actually everything doesn't have to be done on the home estate, and investments can be made away.
Thank you. Brian, we've had a question from Richard Milligan-Manby. And the question is, as incomes fall, will the cost of finance increase in terms of rates and security as agriculture loses its current favourite status as a sector to lend to?
Yeah, I think I perhaps question whether agriculture does lose its favoured status, really. I think agriculture within the banking industry very much seen as a long-term industry. And in more recent years, there's been an increased focus, I think, around not just security in terms of the land behind it, but also the performance of the business and its ability to drive forward. So I think agriculture, and certainly in the discussions I have with colleagues from other banks, I think we all see that long-term future for agriculture. There is a requirement, I think, for businesses to be more proactive in terms of, and perhaps professional at times, in terms of the information they have available and that longer term planning, which farming is very much about. In terms of the cost of finance going forward, each individual business is different. And I think that's the importance of each individual looking at its own business case, putting its own stories forward, having the information around that. And every business gets looked at separate. But we've got to remember we're in a background where the whole economy is in a very challenging period at the moment. We're writing checks at the moment with not really knowing how we're going to pay for them in the future. So in terms of the longer term economy, I wouldn't pick out agriculture particularly. I think there is going to be more challenges there as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. And we've had a question in from Julie Robinson, which I'm going to put to Andrew first. I can imagine that traditional landlord-tenant arrangements may need to change quite radically if the sector is going to make the most of natural capital opportunities, particularly on a landscape scale. Are you already seeing this on estates, e.g. in relation to woodland creation?
No, not as yet, but I would be in complete agreement that landscape scale schemes are going to require a wider agreement amongst tenants and landlord and tenants in terms of delivering them, and that is actually where the let estates can deliver at scale, and I think that's a great opportunity. The challenge will be the division of the spoils, and again that will be on a case-by-case basis.
Susan, any thoughts on that?
It's a very real issue. One of the challenges that we had from the DEFRA forestry team when we were working with them on the tree strategy consultation was, how do we get more trees on tenanted land? And the question as well, do tenants want trees on their land? So it's a very live issue. What I would say is that we're currently developing a guidance note alongside the Tenants Farmers Association about trees and tenancies. So that will be available very, very soon. And that will just provide some of the guidelines and the things that we need to think, landowners and tenants need to think about if they're interested in trees, because trees and woodland is a big scale of things, from individual trees, agroforestry, right through to amenity commercial woodland, and there's different things that might suit different people. So I think considering trees as one thing, it can lead to poor decisions. So we need to be thinking in its breadth what that actually means and how that might work for both parties.
Great, thank you, Susan. We're just going to bring up one final poll whilst I ask the panelists for a key takeaway advice. So if I could ask all of you for just sort of your key points to offer to those listening on how they might start to prepare now for what's coming next year. So if we could start perhaps with Brian.
Yeah, I think it is very much taking a fresh look at every business, their clean piece of paper. What is this business going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time? What do we do really well at the moment? What are we good at? What are we not so good at? What do we need to do a little bit less of? And start planning that through. There is always going to be questions about what elms might look like and everything else, but I think it's really focusing forward as to how you can bring some efficiencies to the business and how you want it to look in the future. I think the other thing I think that people can be getting on with is the CO2 audits, which I think are a useful starting point in terms of understanding your business a little bit more. But it is about critical time to be planning forward. There is a little bit of time we've got as these changes come through, so start sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And Andrew.
With oneself, understand one's assets, and focus on unsupported sectors. This is all very nice, elms, BPS, but the future long term is going to be has to be without both.
Thank you. And finally, Susan.
Yeah, I think agriculture policy is changing. We are having to fight for every single penny from the Treasury after 2024. And while the environment is a high priority for funding, there are no guarantees of what's going to happen. So I think certainly building a business model based around funding from government is probably not a long-term sustainable solution. Part of it, but not for the long term and the core part of your profit.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And I see the poll results are now up, and this is the same poll we put up 6 months ago when we did this at the start of the lockdown, and I'm pleased to say that a lot more of you are reasonably confident now, so that's great news. So I hope today has been helpful. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for the very interesting discussions. We have some more webinars in our series this year, including the Institutional Landowners Group and the Rural Powerhouse Week. My apologies we couldn't get to all the questions today. We will come back to you afterwards. If there are any other topics you would be interested in hearing from us on, please do let us know. This will be recorded for those to watch afterwards. Thank you all once again, and I hope you have a very good day.